Let's jump right into a massive, almost cinematic thought experiment today. What happens if a continent that we mostly associate with luxury goods, historic museums, and soft diplomacy suddenly remembers something old, heavy, and frankly dangerous about itself? Imagine waking up and realizing Europe isn't just an economic giant anymore. It's a unified military superpower. How does the rest of the world even react to that?
Now, this explainer isn't just about the hardware. It's not just counting tanks or submarines. The most fascinating part here is that terrifying, pivotal moment where the global balance of power completely shifts. Because when Europe actually acts as one single force, the geopolitical center of gravity moves right along with it. So we're not asking if it changes the world, but how incredibly fast it changes literally everything.
To really wrap our heads around the impact of this hypothetical reality, we're going to break this explainer down into 5 stages. First, the silent awakening, then forging political unity. Next up, the Industrial Renaissance, followed by shifting global power. And finally, we'll look at the weight of history.
Starting off with Part 1, the silent awakening.
A transformation like this wouldn't just kick off with some sudden dramatic press conference. It's way more subtle than that. For decades, the old assumption was that Europe is a place of comfort, relying on trade, museums, and diplomacy. But a much harder truth is starting to crack through that comfortable surface. We're talking about a serious shift toward deep industrial coordination, cyber defense, and a really disciplined push for true strategic independence.
Which brings us to Part 2, forging political unity. The very first miracle you'd need for this to actually work wouldn't be building weapons. It would be fixing Europe's legendary political fragmentation. I mean, nations that currently spend their time arguing over agricultural budgets and borders would have to evolve into what we call a strategic civilization. They'd have to collectively realize that Europe is way more than just a union of convenience or a shared market. It's an entity with shared security priorities that absolutely has to be defended at scale.
And that leads right into Part 3, the Industrial Renaissance.
If they actually managed to secure that kind of political will, European factories would wake up and start producing at a pace we haven't seen in a very, very long time. We're talking about a massive hardware explosion. Out with the old peace dividend and in with serious, undeniable deterrence. You'd see factories hyper-focused on pumping out advanced drones, integrated air defense systems, and tying it all together with next-gen AI and satellite networks. It would be a complete overhaul.
And here's where it gets super interesting. That intense military urgency would act like a massive catalyst, actually snowballing into a full-on economic boom. Building modern military power requires top-tier engineering talent, right? So as the funding pours in, civilian and military tech start to heavily overlap. Stuff like robotics, semiconductors, and quantum research would just explode. A continent that used to stress out about sluggish economic growth would suddenly become incredibly dynamic simply because survival demanded it.
But how would they actually use all this tech? Well, instead of relying on one giant brute force army, Europe would take its diverse, fragmented identities and align them into a highly sophisticated strategic machine. Their doctrine would lean heavily into layered air defense, rapid mobility, and locking down undersea and cybersecurity. The real superpower move here is interoperability, basically linking all these distinct national forces into one single formidable network.
Let's move on to Part 4, shifting global power.
Geographically, Europe sits right in the middle of the Atlantic, Eurasia, the Arctic, and the Mediterranean. So this newfound strength would absolutely force Washington, Moscow, and Beijing to sit up and pay attention. But we have to highlight a vital distinction here. There is a nightmare version of this scenario, where Europe acts as a sword, going back to its old history of colonial ambition and total rivalry. But the modern, ideal vision is Europe as a shield, a guardian focused purely on defense and resilience, strong enough to discourage any threats without being reckless enough to actually invite them.
It creates this totally fascinating paradox. Think about it like this. The world would feel slightly safer from coercion and slightly more anxious about confrontation at the same time. That perfectly captures the reality of military strength. It acts as a stabilizing backbone, sure, but it also instantly complicates the global arms race. It stops one single nation from completely dominating, but it definitely raises the stakes for everybody else.
Now, crucially, Europe wouldn't just abandon diplomacy. Not at all. In fact, its words would carry a lot more weight because they'd actually be backed up by visible, credible capabilities. When a region has the hard power to physically defend itself, its diplomatic leverage goes through the roof. Europe could take way firmer stances on sanctions, secure key maritime routes, and act as a stabilizing anchor in regions that might otherwise just descend into chaos.
Finally, we arrive at Part 5, the weight of history.
You really can't talk about European rearmament without confronting the elephant in the room, the deep, heavy cultural gravity of Europe wielding this kind of power again. That one word, again, is doing a ton of heavy lifting here. Europe's history is full of devastating wars and empires, meaning a return to superpower status would absolutely haunt the global imagination. The memory of military power in Europe is quite literally written in ruins, trenches, and cemeteries.
Citizens everywhere would be wrestling with this intense emotional core. On one side, you'd have immense pride, a Europe stepping up, taking responsibility for its own safety and returning to a position of true historical agency. But on the flip side, there'd be profound fear, the fear of over-militarization, losing that hard-won peaceful innocence, and the inevitable temptation that raw, unchecked power always brings.
This internal tug-of-war would trigger a massive cultural shift. A continent that feels capable tells completely different stories than one that feels vulnerable. You'd see art, film, and literature reflecting a brand new confidence. Youth culture might take on a much more vigilant, disciplined mood. Basically, Europe would be putting an end to the era of outsourcing its own survival, and that would force society to totally redefine its modern values, finding that really tricky balance between order, freedom, and security.
Which brings us to the ultimate crossroads, and the big question I want to leave you with today. The question isn't whether Europe has the money or the technology to become a military superpower again. They do. The real question is whether it can manage that immense strength with the restraint needed to protect peace, or if it will inevitably repeat the devastating mistakes of its past. Let me know what you think about this scenario down in the comments, and don't forget to stick around for more deep geopolitical explainers.